My name is Silas Greystone. It happened on a Sunday, the day I always brought the family together. The smell of roast chicken filled the house I'd built with my bare hands. Every nail, every beam, every window frame carried my sweat and dreams. But that day, when I reached for a chair at the dining table, my daughter-in-law, Veronica, said it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can sit in the living room, Silas. This table's for family." The words hung in the air like acid, burning through years of kindness. Even my son, Ethan, stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his plate like a coward. I looked around at the table, the polished oak one I had paid for, sitting beneath the chandelier I'd installed myself one rainy Saturday. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I simply stood up, nodded slowly, and walked out into the evening rain. If I wasn't family, I thought as cold drops hit my face, then they were guests in everything I built. That night, I sat on my porch listening to Veronica laugh with her mother on the phone through the open window. Her voice carried clearly in the quiet evening. "He's finally learning his place," she said, giggling like she'd won some competition. I stayed perfectly still, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The storm was beginning to form inside me, but storms need time to gather strength. I replayed the years in my mind like an old film. When Ethan and Veronica were first married 5 years ago, they had absolutely nothing. No savings, no credit, no prospects. I paid their down payment, $20,000 from money I'd saved for retirement. I bought the land, another $15,000. I even designed the house's layout myself, using skills from my 40 years as a contractor. The same house she now ruled like a queen, dismissing me like a servant. But kindness, when mistaken for weakness, becomes an invitation to betrayal. I looked through my old blueprints that night, spreading them across my small kitchen table, and smiled faintly. If she knew how this place was built, I whispered to the empty room, she'd know I never give anything away, not entirely. I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside sat a small safe, dusty blueprints, and a single document stamped in official ink, Deed of Ownership, Greystone Holdings Incorporated. My company. My name. My property. The next morning, Veronica began redecorating the house, tossing out heirlooms that belonged to my late wife, Clara. I watched quietly from the garden, unseen behind the rose bushes Clara had planted 20 years ago, as movers carried away a hand-carved piano she'd adored. My chest tightened, but I remained silent. My neighbor, old Mr. Bellamy, came by with his usual morning greeting and stopped when he saw my face. "Silas, you're too gentle for this world," he said, shaking his head. I smiled, though it felt like lifting stones. "No, Henry. I'm just patient enough to let truth hang itself." Later that night, I overheard Veronica arguing with Ethan through their bedroom window. She wanted to sell the property and start over somewhere more modern, she insisted. Her voice was sharp, demanding. "Once we sell," she said clearly, "we can pay off my mother's debts and live clean. Your father won't need this big house anyway." Ethan mumbled something I couldn't hear. I quietly checked the mail the next morning and found a real estate brochure with my own address listed as pending market evaluation. My hands didn't shake as I held it. Instead, something cold and clear settled over me like armor. I called Mr. Dorian Kessler, the same attorney who'd helped me draft every legal paper I'd ever signed in 40 years of business. He still called me Professor Greystone, a title from my teaching days at the community college. "Dorian, it's time to review an old file," I said calmly. "House deed number 1172G. His tone sharpened immediately over the phone. "The one registered in your company's name?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Exactly. It's about to become relevant again." That evening, Veronica threw a dinner party, bragging loudly to her friends about selling their home. I stood at the edge of the room, quiet as a shadow, smiling politely when anyone glanced my way. "You must know, Mr. Greystone," one guest said with false sympathy, "you're lucky they let you live with them." I laughed softly, genuinely amused. "Oh, my boy, you have no idea where you're standing." The confusion on his face was almost worth the insult. Dorian texted me that night, his message glowing in the darkness, "You were right. She never transferred the deed. You still own the entire property, land, and structures." Morning came bright and cold. Veronica handed me a cup of coffee the next day, pretending nothing had happened, her smile practiced and hollow. "Silas, we'll be selling the house in 2 weeks," she announced cheerfully, like discussing weekend plans. I sipped slowly, tasting the bitterness. "You'll sell it?" She smiled wider, oblivious to the trap closing around her. "Yes. The agent's coming today to take photos and measurements." I nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Make sure he knows who really owns it." Her face froze mid-smile. "Excuse me?" I walked calmly to my study. I unlocked the safe with steady hands and pulled out the deed, the paper crisp and official. "This," I said gently, holding it up to the light, "is where the definition of family begins again." Veronica's smirk vanished like smoke. Ethan walked in at that exact moment, saw the document in my hands, and realized his father might own everything they'd thought was theirs. That afternoon, the real estate agent arrived precisely on time, a young man in a navy suit carrying an expensive clipboard. Veronica led him through the house like royalty giving a palace tour, pointing out features and discussing market value. When they reached my study, I was waiting calmly, the deed positioned clearly on my desk. "Before you proceed," I said without raising my voice, "you should know this home belongs to Greystone Holdings, Incorporated, not Ethan or Veronica." The agent blinked rapidly, confused. "So they don't actually own it legally?" I shook my head slowly. "Not by law. And selling something that isn't yours? That's fraud." Veronica's face turned the color of old paper. I looked at her directly and smiled softly, almost kindly. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "people forget the roots of the trees they enjoy shade from." The agent left quickly, mumbling apologies. But the next morning, I received an envelope slipped under my door with words written in hurried handwriting, "We need to talk." The agent. I met Cole Vance, the agent, at a small cafe downtown where nobody knew us. He looked nervous, fingers drumming on the table, whispering like we were conspirators. "Mr. Greystone, she offered me money to change the ownership on paper before listing. She said her boyfriend could fix things at the clerk's office." Boyfriend. The word echoed in my mind like a bell. "Tell me more," I said, stirring my coffee slowly, "and speak as though truth pays better than lies." Cole confessed everything, Veronica's secret meetings at hotels, the debt collectors constantly after her mother, and a man named Derek Rowan who handles things quietly for people with problems. I thanked him, slid my business card across the scarred table, and said calmly, "Truth always pays, sometimes with interest." That evening, I saw Veronica step outside to take a phone call. Her voice was deliberately low, but the words, "Derek, he's getting suspicious," drifted clearly through the open window. In every house I design, I hide one truth, a secret compartment, a record of what came before. That night, I climbed carefully into the attic of my own home, my knees protesting the ladder. Behind a wooden beam I'd installed myself 30 years ago, I found the box I'd left there, covered in decades of dust. Inside lay my wife Clara's old journal, property papers, and an audio cassette labeled in her handwriting, "For Ethan, when you're ready." I pressed play on my old cassette player. Clara's voice filled the quiet air, trembling but firm with conviction. "If they ever forget who built this family, remind them that kindness is not weakness. It's legacy." Her words became my compass, pointing true north. As I listened, rewinding to hear her voice again, I heard footsteps below. Veronica and Derek were arguing in the kitchen about the old man's files. The next day, Derek arrived at the house uninvited, a lean, confident man wearing mirrored sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. He looked at me like I was merely in his way, an obstacle to remove. "Mr. Greystone," he said with false politeness, "maybe it's time you thought about downsizing to something manageable." I smiled faintly, hands in my pockets. "You must be the handyman Veronica mentioned. Tell me, do you always fix problems that aren't actually broken?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping low and threatening. "Everyone's got a price, old man." I met his gaze without blinking. "Not everyone. Some of us already paid our price in loyalty, in love, and in time. You can't buy what you didn't build with your own hands." That night, I found my tire slashed, rubber split open like a wound. A faint note sat on my windshield, words printed to hide the handwriting, "You should move out while you can." I called Dorian Kessler again, my voice steady despite my anger. "Trace Derek Rowan. I need everything." Within 3 hours, Dorian's voice came through the phone, tight with tension. "Silas, Derek isn't a contractor. He's a debt broker, linked to Veronica's mother's failed loan schemes and possibly worse." The pieces fell into place like dominoes. Veronica wasn't driven by simple greed. She was desperate, drowning, trying to cover her family's financial ruin. And Ethan? Still completely blind to it all. I closed the blueprint on my desk and drew a small red X across the house plan with a pencil. "This isn't about money anymore," I whispered to Clara's photograph on my desk. "It's about rebuilding what truth destroyed." That night, Ethan knocked hesitantly on my study door, his face pale. "Dad," he said shakily, voice cracking, "I think Veronica's hiding something serious. I found messages from a man named Derek on her phone." The next morning, I prepared breakfast for everyone, bacon, eggs, coffee, the smell of forced civility filling the kitchen. Veronica sat across from me, smiling as though the previous night had never happened. Ethan looked torn, his hand trembling slightly around his coffee mug. I spoke gently, like discussing weather. "Do you know the strongest part of a home, Veronica? It's not the walls or the roof. It's the foundation, and foundations crack quietly, invisibly, long before the collapse." Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. Ethan glanced nervously between us. "If a house begins to tremble," I added calmly, "the wise man checks the ground beneath it, not the paint on the walls." The message wasn't lost on her. My phone buzzed. A text from Dorian: "Silas, you were right. Derek's name appears on multiple forged property deeds, including one filed under Veronica's current address." That evening, I invited Ethan to my study privately. I opened a folder of property records, showing him Veronica's signature beside Derek's on a fraudulent deed transfer attempt. He stared, face draining of color. "Dad, she said she only wanted to help with family finances." I replied softly, "A lie told for comfort is still a lie that burns the house it lives in." He sank heavily into the chair, speechless and shaking. "Son, your loyalty isn't your weakness. It's your heritage, what I taught you. But loyalty misplaced becomes servitude." Ethan broke then, confessing that Veronica had convinced him to move my pension funds into her business account, just until her mother's loan cleared. That night, I sat at my drafting table. Blueprints of my old construction projects lay before me, symbols of order, truth, and time invested wisely. "If structure is born from truth," I murmured, "then lies are merely hollow frames waiting to collapse." I began designing something new, not a house this time, but a trap of transparency. The next day, I called my attorney Margaret Vale, a woman as sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous to liars. "We'll start with a complete financial audit," she said briskly. Quietly. "If they're hiding funds anywhere, it'll surface like oil on water." I nodded, satisfied. "Good. I don't wish to destroy her, Margaret. only to teach her that every deception eventually demands its invoice. That evening, Veronica received a letter by certified mail, a legal notice requesting immediate access to all shared assets under her name for audit purposes. Her face went pale as old bones when she read it. Veronica tried desperately to recover ground. She made an elaborate dinner the next night, smiled sweetly across the table, and said in a honey voice, "I think we've had some unfortunate misunderstandings, Silas. Your family, after all." I smiled back, infinitely patient. "You said once that I wasn't," I replied gently, without accusation. "That was your truth then. But truth isn't something we can simply take back, only learn from." Her voice faltered noticeably. "I didn't mean it that way. Intent is the language of the heart," I said, cutting my food methodically. "But character is what speaks when intent fails." Ethan watched silently, torn between love and awakening conscience. During cleanup, I received a call from Margaret. "Silas," she said carefully, "Veronica's accounts show large transfers to Derek, and one transfer to a name I didn't expect at all, your late wife, Clara." My pulse didn't rise, not from anger, but from sudden realization. "Clara's account," I whispered into the phone. "That account was legally closed years ago after her death." Margaret continued, voice tight, "Someone reopened it approximately 6 months ago, likely using falsified identity documents. The deposits match funds withdrawn from your family trust." I leaned back heavily in my chair. "Then we're not dealing with simple greed anymore. We're dealing with legacy theft, the worst kind of betrayal." Veronica entered my study then, pretending concern, her face a mask. "You've been unusually quiet lately, Silas. Are you feeling all right?" I replied calmly, "Quiet men hear earthquakes before anyone else feels the tremors." The next morning, I found a sealed envelope outside my door. Inside was a photograph of my late wife's grave, the earth freshly disturbed, with a typed note, "If you dig into the past, you might unearth what should stay buried." I spent the next morning walking through the town square, where I had once built the clock tower that still chimes faithfully on the hour. People nodded respectfully, smiled with genuine warmth, but one man didn't. Derek. He looked distinctly uneasy when he saw me approaching. His eyes darted like a thief's shadow. "You've been busy," I said mildly, hands in pockets. "I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "You should," I replied evenly. "You forged my name once. The ink of deceit leaves a smell that doesn't wash off easily." He froze completely. I continued walking casually, hands still in pockets, as though merely discussing the pleasant weather. That evening, Margaret called again, voice urgent. "Silas, Derek's construction company owes $500,000 in unpaid taxes. And guess whose name was used as collateral?" "Mine," I said quietly, not surprised anymore. "Of course mine." I discovered later that my own signature had been digitally copied onto the debt papers. Someone had been planning this for months, maybe longer. I didn't fight Derek in court immediately. Instead, I invited him to the town's Chamber of Commerce meeting, where everyone of importance attended. Business owners, bankers, even the mayor filled the room. Halfway through routine business, I stood up calmly and addressed the assembled room. "We speak constantly of progress," I began, voice carrying clearly, "but true progress has no debt of deceit attached." I displayed one of the forged contracts on the projector and said nothing more. Silence did the rest of my work. Gasps filled the room like wind. Derek's face drained completely of color. "A man's character," I said simply, "is the only collateral truly worth keeping." The town began whispering immediately. Word spread within hours about the forgery, the debt, the lies built on lies. By sunset, Derek's company account was frozen by court order. That night, Veronica stormed into my home, fury replacing her usual calculated calm. She accused me of publicly humiliating her friend, in front of the whole town. But in her rage, She let slip something crucial. She'd known about the debt months before, had even helped Derek forge the initial documents. It rained that night, the kind of rain that erases footprints but not conscience. Ethan sat in my study, silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Dad, Veronica told me to sign your name on documents. She said it was temporary, that you wouldn't mind helping family." I closed my eyes, feeling old. "Temporary deceit," I said quietly, "is still permanent dishonor." He broke down then, tears mixing with guilt and shame. I thought I was helping her. She said she'd pay everything back once her business took off. I rested a hand on his shaking shoulder. A foundation built on lies always collapses eventually under its own weight. That same night, Margaret sent another detailed report. Veronica and Derek were co-owners of a shell company registered under my wife's stolen name, Clara Holdings. I quietly prepared a public records complaint. But before filing it, I received an unexpected call from Veronica's mother, Irene, begging me not to ruin her daughter. She revealed something shocking. "Silas, Veronica isn't just greedy. She's desperate. Derek has been blackmailing her for over a year." I met Irene the next day at the small cafe by the river. Her hands trembled visibly as she spoke in whispers. Derek found out about Veronica's old debts, the gambling problem in college, the fraud case that was sealed. He threatened to expose everything unless she gave him access to your trust funds. I sat back, feeling cold inside despite the warm coffee. So she sold integrity to buy silence. "Please," Irene whispered desperately, "she's not evil, Silas. She's just scared and trapped." "Fear," I said softly but firmly, "is the seed of every lie. But when fear grows into deliberate manipulation, it's no longer fear. It's corruption." I thanked her for her honesty, paid for her coffee, and left. Then I did something unexpected. I called Veronica directly. "We need to talk," I said calmly. "At the house. Tomorrow evening." That evening, I received a message from Margaret, "The audit just finished. The funds are completely traceable. Derek transferred everything offshore yesterday. He's preparing to run." I set the stage carefully, deliberately, as always. I invited Ethan, Veronica, and Derek to the house at dusk. When they arrived, I had 3 chairs arranged in the living room, and a single folder resting on the coffee table. "You've all taken something from me," I began quietly. "But what you've truly stolen is peace, and that I cannot replace with money." Derek scoffed confidently, "You can't prove anything, old man." I smiled faintly, almost sadly. "I don't need to prove anything. You already did." I turned on the television. Margaret appeared via video call, professional and precise. She read out the complete forensic audit, forged deeds, blackmail emails, offshore transfers, and finally, the falsified Clara Holdings Company. Veronica's face crumbled like old paper. Derek turned pale as milk. "You used my late wife's name," I said, my voice like stone finally breaking. "You built your greed upon her grave." Veronica broke down sobbing. Ethan sat frozen, barely breathing. "I never wanted this," she sobbed through her hands. "And yet," I said quietly, "you built it with your own hands, choice by choice." The police knocked on the door then, not for me, but for Derek. Margaret had filed the complaint hours before our meeting. The police lights faded into the dusk, leaving behind only the echo of Derek's protests and threats. Veronica stood trembling in my doorway, mascara streaking like ink in rain. "You planned all this," she whispered accusingly. "No," I replied softly, "you did, the moment you stopped listening to conscience." She begged desperately for Ethan's forgiveness, but my son turned away, unable to look at her. "You made me choose between love and honor," he said, voice breaking. "I chose wrong, and now I have to live with that." That night, I sat alone in my study, listening to the familiar creak of the old house, the same house my wife had once filled with laughter and music. And for the first time in months, I whispered to her photograph, "Clara, it's almost over now." As I locked away the case file, a call came from Margaret. "Silas, there's something else." A dormant account in Clara's name just became active again. Margaret and I reviewed the new documents by morning. The bank logs showed a transfer from Clara Holdings, the shell company Derek used, into a legitimate trust Clara had created before her death. "Someone tried to launder money through her old estate," Margaret said, studying the papers. "Or," I replied slowly, understanding dawning, "someone wanted me to find it." There was an old note attached to the account name, written unmistakably in Clara's handwriting, "If truth is buried, Silas will dig it out." My throat tightened painfully. Clara had known this day might come somehow. She'd left breadcrumbs, just like she always did when she wanted to test my patience and wisdom. The audit showed one name linked to the reactivation of the account, Veronica's father, long presumed dead. I traveled to the next state that afternoon, tracing the digital trail to a remote property near Black Ridge Falls. There, I met him, Lawrence Merrow, Veronica's estranged father. A ghost returned. He looked older than his years, eyes sharp with accumulated regret. "I warned her not to marry into money," he said bitterly. "And yet she did," I replied, "then tried to own what she didn't build." He explained everything slowly. How Derek had found him years ago, offered him hush money to help forge Clara's trust papers, and promised Veronica a life of wealth and security. "She thought if she could control your estate, she could finally belong somewhere," Lawrence said sadly. "But all she did was chain herself to a thief." I learned that Veronica wasn't just blackmailed initially. She had blackmailed Derek first, after discovering his affair with her best friend. I returned home with new clarity. Everyone had been playing each other in an elaborate game. Derek used Veronica. Veronica used Derek. And Ethan was used by both, a pawn in someone else's chess match. That evening, I called a meeting at the house again, only family this time. I laid out the full truth on the table, no shouting, no blame, just silence heavy with accumulated shame. "We cannot rebuild on lies," I said firmly. "But we can start again on truth, if you're brave enough to face it." Veronica finally spoke, voice small. "I thought you'd throw me out immediately." "You already did that," I replied gently, "when you said I wasn't family." Just as the room began to soften slightly, a letter arrived by courier. From Derek's attorney. Inside was a single page, "If I go down, everyone does." Attached was a flash drive. I connected the flash drive to my computer, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A complete digital ledger of transactions not only tying Derek to the fraud, but implicating the town's own mayor and bank director in the money laundering scheme. This wasn't just family betrayal anymore. It was a web of corruption built systematically under my roof. "He used me," I said aloud to the empty room. My reputation was their currency. Margaret urged me strongly to go to the press immediately. But I chose differently, as always. "No," I said firmly. "We let the truth find its own path. I'll speak only once, and never again." The next day, at the town hall, I stood before the entire community. I told them the story, not to shame anyone, but to teach. Wealth without integrity is poverty in disguise. And silence, when truth is desperately needed, is the loudest kind of betrayal. The room was absolutely still. The mayor resigned on the spot, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Ethan held Veronica's hand tightly. She wept quietly, perhaps for the first time with real sincerity. As I left the hall, Margaret handed me one last sealed envelope, labeled, "For Silas, from Clara." I didn't open Clara's envelope that night. I waited until morning, when the light through the kitchen window looked like the way she used to smile, soft, forgiving, infinitely patient. Inside was a handwritten note in her familiar cursive, slightly faded. Silas, if you're reading this, it means the truth has tried to hide itself again. Don't chase justice blindly. Become it. Protect Ethan, even from his own heart. And remember, not every betrayal means you've failed. Sometimes, it's how the world teaches us who we are. Below the letter was a small brass key and a location written in pencil: the Willow Box, Elderfield Cemetery. The cemetery was quiet, draped in morning mist like a veil. Beneath the old willow tree where Clara and I used to walk on summer evenings, there was a small lockbox buried in the roots. Inside, old photographs from our early years, receipts from the early days of my business, and a single document, the original deed to our family estate, naming both our signatures. But there was more. A second copy of the deed, unfiled, with Veronica's forged signature clumsily added. Derek's handwriting confirmed it. Clara had known. She'd discovered their plot long before I did, long before anyone knew. You saw the storm coming, I whispered to her memory, and you left me the map. A sound behind me. Footsteps. It was Ethan. He'd found me, but not alone. Veronica was with him, and she was holding something in her hand, a second letter, also from Clara. Veronica's eyes were swollen, but her voice was steady now. She left me this, she said, handing it over with trembling fingers. Clara's handwriting again: Veronica, love him truly or not at all. If you ever hurt this family, remember, Silas will not hate you. He'll outlive your deceit with grace. Veronica broke down then, no pretense, no performance left. She knew me better than I knew myself, she cried. That was Clara's gift, I replied gently. She saw the light in people, even when they were lost in their own shadow. Together, we walked home in silence. The town had already begun whispering, but it didn't matter anymore. By evening, Derek and the corrupt officials were formally indicted. But my house, my home, was filled with something rarer than victory: clarity. That night, Ethan confessed one more truth. Dad, Derek wasn't the only one who used your name. Ethan revealed it all. During his lowest moment, he had mortgaged part of my lumber business under my name, trying desperately to keep up appearances for Veronica's demanding family. It wasn't malice. It was pride, the deadliest sin. He expected fury, maybe violence. But I only smiled faintly, understanding completely. You remind me of myself at your age, I said quietly. Desperate to prove worth where none needed proving. Instead of punishment, I gave him the papers and said firmly, fix it. Not for me, for yourself. Let this be your true inheritance, responsibility. For the first time, he met my eyes like an equal, not a child. That was the moment I realized revenge had never been the point of any of this. Restoration was. I received one final call later, a community representative inviting me to speak at the town's annual gathering. The theme: what we owe each other. I stood at the podium that evening, beneath the old clock tower I'd helped build 40 years ago. The same townspeople who once whispered behind my back now watched in complete silence. I began slowly, choosing words carefully. When I was told I wasn't family, I believed it for a moment. Because betrayal blinds you completely. It makes you question your own kindness, your own worth. I paused, letting the words settle. The crowd was absolutely still. Even the air felt like it was listening. But what I've learned is this: people can take your trust, your money, even your name and reputation. But they can't take your meaning unless you hand it to them willingly. I paused again. Forgiveness isn't weakness, I continued, voice strengthening. It's proof that your soul survived the fire. Afterward, Ethan and Veronica stood beside me. Not perfect, but healing slowly. Margaret smiled from the back of the hall, satisfied. And as I walked home under the fading light, I looked up at the darkening sky and whispered, we did it, Clara. Not for revenge. For peace. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. Ethan and Veronica were working to repair what they'd broken. It wouldn't be easy or quick. Some things take years to rebuild. But they were trying, and that mattered. I spent the following weeks teaching Ethan the business properly, the way I should have years ago. Every morning, we'd go over contracts, review blueprints, discuss integrity in business. He listened now, really listened, the way he hadn't since childhood. Veronica took a job at the community center, working with families in financial crisis. Perhaps helping others would help her understand what she'd done. Derek was sentenced to 5 years for fraud and forgery. The corrupt officials lost their positions, their reputations destroyed. But I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only sadness that it had to happen at all. One evening, I found Ethan sitting in my study, holding one of Clara's old journals. She wrote about me, he said, voice thick with emotion. About hoping I'd grow up strong enough to admit when I was wrong. I sat beside him. Your mother was wise. She knew that strength isn't in never falling. It's in getting back up. The town gradually returned to normal. Mr. Bellamy still stopped by for morning coffee. The clock tower still chimed on the hour. But something had changed, something fundamental. People treated truth more carefully now, like fragile glass. Months passed. The house was legally and officially mine again, all paperwork corrected. But I made a decision that surprised everyone. I called Ethan and Veronica to my study one evening. I'm transferring ownership to you, I said, sliding papers across the desk. Legally, properly, the way it should have been done from the start. They stared in shock. But Dad, Ethan protested, after everything, I held up my hand. You've learned the cost of betrayal. You've worked to repair it. Now I'm teaching you the weight of responsibility. This house, this legacy, it's yours to protect now. Veronica began crying. I don't deserve this. None of us deserve grace, I replied gently. That's why it's called grace. But I added one condition. A plaque would hang in the entryway, engraved with simple words, built by Silas Greystone. Maintained by those who remember. They agreed immediately. The plaque was installed the following week. Sometimes I'd see Veronica pause in front of it, touching the letters gently, remembering. I moved into a smaller house nearby, one I'd designed myself years ago but never used. It was perfect for one person, full of light and quiet. I spent my days woodworking, reading, visiting with old friends. Ethan came by twice a week, sometimes with Veronica, sometimes alone. We'd talk about everything and nothing, slowly rebuilding what had been broken. One afternoon, a young couple approached me at the hardware store. Mr. Greystone, the woman asked nervously. We heard what happened. We're having trouble with my husband's family. They're trying to take our house. Could you give us advice? I invited them for coffee. I told them about documentation, about keeping records, about the importance of legal clarity. But mostly I told them about patience, about letting truth work at its own pace. Revenge is easy, I said. Restoration is hard. But only restoration heals. They thanked me profusely. Word spread. Others came with similar stories, families in conflict, properties in dispute, relationships strained by money and pride. I helped where I could, always teaching the same lessons I'd learned. Truth. Patience. Grace. My small house became a gathering place for wisdom. People called me Professor again, the title I'd earned through experience, not just education. One evening, sitting on my porch watching the sunset, I realized something profound. Veronica's cruelty had been terrible, yes. The betrayal had cut deep. But it had also revealed truth I needed to see, about my son, about my own boundaries, about the difference between kindness and enabling. Sometimes the worst moments teach the best lessons. I thought about the viral stories I'd heard, about revenge and justice. But this wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about showing that dignity doesn't demand cruelty. That strength can be quiet. That winning doesn't require destroying others. I pulled out my phone and recorded a simple message. Someone once told me I wasn't family in the house I built. For a moment, I believed her. But here's what I learned: your worth isn't defined by those who diminish you. It's defined by how you respond when they do. I chose truth over revenge, restoration over destruction. And in the end, everyone learned something valuable. And that's how life reminded me: being told you're not family doesn't make it true. Sometimes, the ones who cast you out end up standing at your door, asking to be let back in. Tell me, what would you have done if someone told you you weren't family in your own house? Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more true stories of wisdom and justice, and remember, life has its own way of evening the scales, quietly, but perfectly. Thanks for watching.